Welcome to the deep dive. You sent us your sources, and we're here to do what we do best: extract the crucial insights and give you a shortcut to understanding what's really going on.
Today, we're diving deep into excerpts from a book that has certainly stirred a lot of conversation. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s The Real Anthony Fauci.
That's right.
Our goal is really to explore the arguments and viewpoints presented in these excerpts, focusing on the criticisms leveled against Dr. Anthony Fauci, various government health agencies, and, well, the pharmaceutical industry.
Exactly. And just so you know, for this deep dive, our source material is direct excerpts from The Real Anthony Fauci.
Right.
So keep in mind, our mission isn't to independently verify every single claim, but more to understand the core concerns and arguments the book is putting forward, regarding public health decisions, the integrity of scientific research, and these potential conflicts of interest.
Makes sense.
Okay, let's unpack the initial picture these excerpts paint.
Well, the book starts by referencing a pretty significant global event, which, okay, it's not explicitly named, but it's clearly the recent pandemic that affected, well, everyone.
Right.
And the initial assertion is that various trusted health institutions seem to operate in a coordinated way, a way that fostered fear and obedience, and maybe even discouraged people from thinking critically about the whole situation.
And it goes further, doesn't it? It alleges what the book calls mass public health experiments.
Yeah, using a novel technology. And like you said, it's not explicitly stated, but the context strongly suggests mRNA vaccines. And here's where it gets interesting. The claim is that the manufacturers of this technology insisted on, and actually got, liability protection from governments all over the world.
Even before large-scale production.
Yeah, that's the claim. And this leads into a broader accusation in the book, suggesting that Western nations adopted tactics. Well, tactics you might see, it argues, in rising totalitarian regimes.
That's pretty strong language. What kind of tactics?
The excerpts list things like widespread propaganda, censorship of dissenting voices, orchestrated public fear, manipulating scientific findings, suppression of open debate, vilifying those who disagreed, and even using force against peaceful protests.
It's a really stark portrayal. And the excerpts then claim that individuals who were hesitant or maybe refused these medical interventions, described as unwanted, experimental, zero liability.
Right.
They were subjected to what the book calls orchestrated gaslighting, meaning they were made to doubt their own perceptions, basically.
And marginalized, scapegoated. That's the picture painted.
Okay, so then it shifts gears a bit, talking about regulatory capture.
Yeah, the author expresses this sense of astonishment, really, at what they describe as a pervasive web of deep financial entanglements between pharma and the government health agencies.
Calling it regulatory capture on steroids.
Exactly. And just for clarity, regulatory capture is basically when the agencies supposed to oversee an industry get, well, too influenced by that industry, potentially making decisions that help the companies more than the public.
And the book excerpts give some, pretty striking figures to back this up, right?
They do. We're told the CDC owns a fair number of vaccine patents, 57, according to the excerpt.
57.
And that back in 2019, it spent nearly $5 billion of its $12 billion budget just on buying and distributing vaccines.
That certainly raises questions about potential conflicts of interest, doesn't it?
It does indeed. And the excerpts also highlight the NIH owning hundreds of vaccine patents, again, suggesting another potential financial stake in the products they regulate.
Yeah.
Plus, the book alleges that high-level officials, including Dr. Fauci, received substantial annual royalty payments, maybe up to $150,000 a year, on products they were involved in developing and then approving. These kinds of financial links, they can create at least the appearance of bias.
Absolutely. And the FDA's funding comes under scrutiny, too. The claim is that 45% of its budget comes from the pharmaceutical industry through these things called user fees.
Right. So as the author points out, it makes you wonder about the overall health of the American public within that kind of financial landscape.
Yeah.
The author also throws in a personal reflection, mentioning how some people, perhaps based on political leanings, often defend these agencies. Maybe not fully seeing the argument that years of criticism might have maybe inadvertently push them closer to Big Pharma's interests.
Okay, so then the focus moves squarely onto Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Yes. The book, based on these excerpts, seems set on tracing his career and arguing he played a central role in what it calls a historic coup d'etat against Western democracy.
Through the militarization and monetization of medicine. That's a very, very critical statement.
It is. And the excerpts indicate the book tries to explore how mainstream media big tech, even military and intelligence communities allegedly allied with big pharma and public health agencies to push this narrative.
It's interesting, though, how the book describes the early public view of Dr. Fauci.
Right. In the early days of the pandemic, a lot of people, particularly maybe Democrats or liberals, saw him as this reassuring, authoritative figure.
Grounded in science, a counterweight to President Trump during all that uncertainty.
Exactly. The book uses this analogy of Ulysses navigating between Scylla and Charybdis, that image of a steady hand in a crisis.
But then the book contrasts that view pretty sharply with its later claims.
Yeah, that's what's notable. The excerpts argue that Dr. Fauci's strategies, the ones he implemented, consistently failed to deliver, while at the same time boosting pharma profits and bureaucratic power.
And it gives that comparison of COVID-19 death rates.
Oh yeah, that's quite provocative, citing China and Tanzania as having much lower death rates per million compared to what it calls cataclysmically awful results elsewhere.
Implicitly, the U.S. and similar countries.
That seems to be the implication. And despite these alleged failures, the excerpts point out he continued as COVID response director in the Biden administration.
The suggestion being that the public, caught up in fear, couldn't really see the strategies weren't working.
That seems to be the book's argument, yes.
Yeah.
That fear may be obscured a critical assessment.
Okay, let's turn to the impact of the countermeasures, especially lockdowns. The excerpts make some really serious claims here.
They do, asserting that these measures actually led to epidemics of cardiovascular disease and undiagnosed cancer.
Which, if true, would be huge public health consequences.
Absolutely. And the excerpt also mentions a projected increase in deaths just from the economic shock of unemployment.
And the list of negative social impacts linked to lockdowns in the book is just extensive.
It really is. Breakdown of food chains, more child abuse, suicide, addiction, alcoholism, obesity, mental illness, developmental delays, isolation, depression, educational deficits. It's a very broad swipe.
And it cites specific studies.
Yeah, an Ohio State study reportedly finding a 50% rise in child suicide rates.
Oof.
And a Brown University study apparently indicating a significant drop in IQ points for infants born during quarantine.
The human cost is really emphasized too. Record overdose deaths, more adolescent mental health ER visits, millions dying alone in hospitals and nursing homes.
Yeah, it's grim stuff. And what's particularly striking is this alleged admission from Dr. Fauci.
What's that?
That he reportedly never assessed the costs of desolation, poverty, unhealthy isolation, and depression from his countermeasures, claiming his sole focus was just public health.
Which suggests a very narrow view of what public health includes.
Precisely. And then the excerpts touch on whether the lockdowns were even effective, referencing arguments that studies suggest they didn't significantly cut infection rates compared to places that took a more laissez-faire approach.
So that raises big questions about the justification for these measures.
It does. And the narrative in the book then moves into allegations of deception, data manipulation, introducing this idea of Dr. Fauci's alleged noble lies.
Noble lies? Like what?
Reportedly things like misleading info about masks, changing herd immunity estimates based on polling, not science. The excerpt suggests a pattern, really, of shaping information to push a specific vaccine agenda. It claims he believed in post-infection immunity privately, but downplayed it publicly, pushing vaccines for previously infected people without, the book says, scientific justification.
So blatant manipulation of data for the vaccine agenda. That's the accusation.
That's the core accusation,
yeah.
It's relentless manipulation. And this leads to a critique about the data quality itself during the pandemic.
How so?
The excerpts describe the data quality as shockingly low, accusing officials, often naming Dr. Fauci, of quackery, obfuscation, making things unclear.
Cherry-picking data.
Exactly. Cherry-picking supportive data, ignoring the rest, and a blatant perversion of data.
And the claim is that these mistakes always went one way.
Consistently, according to the book, inflating coronavirus risks and exaggerating vaccine safety and effectiveness, painting a picture of deliberately generating fear to get compliance.
Which led to what the book calls arbitrary mandates. Masks, lockdowns, vaccines.
Right. Justified by citing captive agencies, WHO, CDC, FDA, NIH, rather than solid scientific studies. That's the argument presented.
The book also pushes back against just trusting the experts.
Yeah, it emphasizes that science changes, experts disagree, politics and self-interest can play a role. It even points to how experts argue against each other in lawsuits.
Okay. So moving on to alternative treatments, The book highlights several experts.
Right, figures like Dr. Pierre Corey, Dr. Peter McCullough, even Nobel laureate Luc Montagnier. They argued for early outpatient treatment.
The idea being that could have averted lockdowns.
Yeah, prevent hospitalizations, lessen severity, avoid lockdowns, and maybe achieve herd immunity through natural infection in low-risk groups. That was their reported stance.
And they also claimed natural immunity was better than vaccine immunity.
Superior, yes,
Yeah.
in terms of duration and breadth against variants. That's what the excerpts say they argued. It mentions a study by Dr. McCullough and others describing a range of effective early treatment drugs.
But these approaches faced resistance.
According to the excerpts, yes. A lack of support, even hostility, from U.S. health agencies, supposedly orchestrated by Dr. Fauci, and from big universities, which often depend on NIH funding. Resistance towards using these existing repurposed medicines.
Dr. McCullough is quoted saying basically no original research on early treatment came out of major U.S. medical centers.
That's the quote included, yeah. And Dr. Cole is quoted even more forcefully, calling the neglect of early treatment unprecedented and harmful.
And calling for the doctor-patient relationship to be taken aback from the government medical pharmaceutical industrial complex.
That quote really sums up the viewpoint in this part of the book. Demanding patients demand treatment.
Okay, then the hydroxychloroquine or HCQ controversy.
Right. The excerpt makes a point that the FDA had approved HCQ for 65 years for other things without major limits. The CDC considered it safe for malaria prevention, even long-term.
So the book finds Dr. Fauci's sudden claims of its danger for COVID specious or misleading.
That's the term used. And it highlights the FDA's unprecedented move to revoke HCQ's emergency authorization. Based, it says, on trials using high doses late in hospitalization.
And the allegation is this sidelined existing HCQ stockpiles while protecting new drug profits.
That's the connection the book makes. It also points fingers at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the BMGF, alleging they funded studies that used deliberately wrong doses and timing, leading the FDA to wrongly conclude HCQ was ineffective at safe levels.
Even claiming BMGF researchers knew the proper way to use it, but participated in flawed trials anyway.
That's the claim. The SurgSphere scandal has also mentioned those fraudulent studies in The Lancet and NEJM that damaged HCQ's reputation.
And political interference, too. Governors, medical boards blocking prescriptions.
Instances of that are noted in the excerpts, yes. Plus, an NIH-eyed outpatient trial for HCQ being halted due to low enrollment is presented as more evidence of disinterest.
And then there's ivermectin, a similar story.
A very similar pattern presented in the excerpts, contrasting Dr. Fauci's alleged efforts to stop its use in the U.S. with its reported use elsewhere. Tokyo, India, Indonesia, Israel, El Salvador.
It mentions Dr. Laurie's review showing strong evidence for it.
Yes, and her appeal to the British PM. The role of the Cochrane collaboration in reviewing trial data is also brought up.
But then it focuses on Dr. Andrew Hill.
Right, an advisor to Gates and Clinton foundations, sponsored by Unitaid, which gets BMGF funding. The book alleges Hill faced pressure to downplay ivermectin's effectiveness, even though his own analysis apparently showed benefits.
There's even dialogue mentioned between Laurie and Hill about lives potentially saved.
Yes, that's included in the excerpts, and then a link is drawn to Merck's expensive drug, molnupiravir,
which has a similar mechanism to ivermectin.
Yes, suggesting a financial motive to suppress the cheap, off-patent ivermectin. The book also mentions safety concerns emerging about molnupiravir.
But Dr. Fauci spoke positively about molnupiravir's trials.
That contrast is highlighted, as is the claim that the Gates-backed group JDI questioned ivermectin use in humans somewhat insincerely, given they distributed it for other conditions.
And the whole Joe Rogan situation is mentioned.
Yeah, the media vilification for using ivermectin and debunking that false Rolling Stone story about ERs being backed up with overdoses.
Okay, what about remdesivir?
Concerns are raised there, too. The book points to a Chinese study in The Lancet, published before Fauci's trials finished, apparently showing remdesivir was ineffective and toxic.
Higher rate of serious injuries compared to placebo.
That's what the Chinese study reportedly found, yes. And the book stresses this was a rigorous study, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center, peer-reviewed, data available, contrasting it with remdesivir's later promotion in the West.
Then the focus shifts to the vaccine trials themselves and safety.
Yes, the book alleges a strategy by Dr. Fauci to cut the trials short at 6 months and vaccinate the control groups.
The worry being that this prevents seeing long-term problems, like pathogenic priming.
Exactly. Pathogenic priming being that theoretical risk where the vaccine could potentially make a later infection worse. The book notes, the Pfizer trial was initially planned for 3 years.
So a 6-month study would miss potential long-term issues like cancers, autoimmune problems, fertility issues, neurological stuff.
That's the concern raised. It mentions an AHRQ study allegedly showing serious injuries in 1 in 40 recipients, leading the CDC to supposedly shut down the project.
And alleges Fauci got media help to suppress injury reports.
Enlisted mainstream and social media, the book claims, to censor reporting of injuries and deaths, including silencing doctors raising concerns about pathogenic priming.
Alleging collusion with big tech, Facebook, Google to censor criticism.
That's mentioned, yes. Along with the claim that science journals, reliant on pharma ads, refuse to publish studies on adverse reactions.
And the Gates-funded fact-checkers.
PolitiFact. Fact-check their role in debunking injury stories is discussed. The book calls the Pfizer 6-month safety report damning and alleges a conspiracy involving FDA officials, VAERS, media to hide harm. Though, important note, VAERS just collects reports, doesn't prove causation.
Right, and alleged data manipulation by the CDC on vaccine effectiveness.
Yes, the claim is they skewed results by including data from when most people were unvaccinated, making effectiveness look better.
And omitting later data on vaccinated people getting hospitalized with Delta, data that was available from other countries.
That alleged omission is noted too. And then the really serious claim about Pfizer manipulating trial data.
Specifically hiding the injury of Maddie DeGara, a young participant.
To get emergency authorization for kids.
That's the allegation. And the book emphasizes how significant her case could be if extrapolated to all teens.
Okay, let's talk about NIAI, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases under Fauci. The book paints NIAID under his leadership as the hub of corrupting financial ties with Pharma, operating more like a drug company than a science agency, is the claim.
It quotes Celia Farber dividing scientists into serfs of Anthony Fauci protecting grants and genuine scientists facing persecution.
Yes, that quote is included, suggesting Fauci's influence crushed the natural scientific impulse to question things.
And Carrie Mullis, the PCR inventor, calling scientists serfs of Fauci.
That quote is in there too, contrasted with Fauci's own statements about always telling the truth. And Harvey Biley's assertion that AIDS science became stagnant may be caused by chemicals, criticizing the lack of cures or real vaccines.
The book then takes a historical look at infectious disease deaths.
Right. It challenges what it calls the popular orthodoxy from CDC and NIAID that vaccines were the main reason mortality dropped.
Instead, it cites a 2000 study, CDC, and Johns Hopkins.
Yes, in pediatrics. Reportedly concluding vaccines didn't account for the big drop in the early 20th century. Nearly 90% of the decline happened before widespread antibiotics or vaccines.
Then it presents the AIDS pandemic as a kind of template.
A shakedown cruise for Fauci, the book says, regarding the AZT approval, claiming he pioneered corrupt practices then that he'd use later.
Like blocking aerosol pentamidine for PCP prevention in AIDS patients, even though doctors knew it worked.
Allegedly, yes. And refusing NIH guidelines for bacterium prevention, demanding randomized controlled trials.
The gold standard.
Right. But the irony pointed out is that NIH hadn't funded such trials for those unpatented drugs. This is then contrasted with his later support for things like the Community Research Initiative in the AIDS crisis.
What about the AZT trials themselves? Freedom of information requests?
The book mentions the FOIA request and the bombshell Spitzig report, alleging cheating by Boston investigators who had incentives to keep patients alive longer in the trial.
And AZT itself is described really harshly.
As possibly the most toxic drug ever approved long-term, quoting Peter Duesberg calling it a random terminator of DNA synthesis, and Joseph Sonnabend saying it was incompatible with life.
And NBC News exposé is mentioned too.
Yeah, on the official trial, reporting tampering, not being double-blind, volunteers sharing the drug, using other remedies, casting doubt on the results.
And Celia Farber again, calling the AIDS apparatus a beast system created by Fauci, crushing dissent using woke violence, drawing a parallel to COVID.
Yes, and the author, RFK Jr., says he's not taking a side on the science, but is suspicious and angered by the alleged censorship and refusal to debate, quoting George R.R. Martin about silencing truth-tellers.
Then there's Robert Gallo and the early HIV/AIDS story.
John Crudsen's book is highlighted, alleging Gallo pushed discoveries and used science by press release, a tactic the book says Fauci adopted.
It mentions Gallo's earlier unsuccessful claim about finding a leukemia virus, HL23.
Right. And alleges confirmation-biased research led to an expanding definition of AIDS via indiscriminate PCR testing.
Even though Mullis, the inventor, warned PCR couldn't prove active infection.
Exactly. So unrelated illnesses allegedly got labeled AIDS just based on a positive PCR test. The book also questions the different patterns of AIDS in the West versus Africa.
And Koch's postulates, the gold standard for proving causation.
The book claims the HIV/AIDS hypothesis fails the first postulate finding HIV in large quantities in every patient.
And points out that all AIDS-defining illnesses also happen in HIV-negative people.
Yes. It alleges media self-censorship on this, waiting for cues from Fauci. It recounts a Newsweek reporter covering non-HIV/AIDS cases at a conference.
And Fauci allegedly moved fast to shut that down.
By declaring it a new disease, idiopathic CD4 plus lymphocytopenia, or ICL. That's the claim.
The book also argues HIV infects few cells, so antivirals must kill healthy T cells.
Right, suggesting the immune collapse isn't fully explained by HIV alone. It includes quotes from scientists like Coffin, Love, Evitt, expressing doubts about HIV as the sole cause or the evidence for it being contagious.
The Perth group even argued Gallo and Montagnier never properly isolated HIV.
That argument is mentioned. And Montaigne's surprising 1990 statement that HIV might be benign.
It also revisits early AIDS cases, rare pneumonia, Kaposi sarcoma in gay men.
And suggests recreational drug use, like amyl nitrite poppers and antibiotic overuse, might have played a role in immune collapse. Citing Dr. Gottlieb's early observations, Dr. Haverkos's research, Randy Schiltz's book, Blaming Poppers.
Even Gallo privately admitted HIV might just be a catalytic factor in Kaposi sarcoma and wasn't found in the tumors.
That private 1994 acknowledgement is included in the excerpts, yes.
Then comes Dr. Duisberg's argument about AZT itself causing AIDS deaths.
Right, that after 1987, most deaths blamed on AIDS were actually caused by AZT toxicity, this chemotherapy drug causing immune collapse, AIDS by AZT.
Highlighting the FDA's initial view of AZT as too toxic even for short-term cancer use. Mutagenic, caused cancer in rodents, destroyed bone marrow and blood cells.
All those points about AZT's known toxicity are emphasized in the excerpts.
Okay, shifting to the historical context of medical experimentation, the book brings up some disturbing examples.
Yeah, alleged instances where government regulators and pharma combined racial discrimination with child abuse in drug and vaccine development. Polio vaccine experiments in Congo, risky measles vaccine tests on Black children.
And specifically, NIH-sanctioned experiments on thousands of children, mostly Black and Hispanic orphans in foster care.
At least 14,000, the book claims, without proper oversight or informed consent. The Incarnation Children's Center, ICC trials, are a key example.
Where NIA allegedly paid for the kids, the safety board had conflicts, many might not have even had HIV, and toxic drugs were given in a non-medical setting.
That's the picture painted. And the book notes the Vera Institute confirmed 80 deaths and many others seriously harmed in these trials.
Including a quote from Vera Sharav accusing Fauci of poo-pooing the deaths and failing to get involved.
Yes, a very critical account.
Then the nevirapine controversy in Uganda, described as a three-ring circus of flim-flam.
That's the book's phrasing, yes. Alleging major ethical problems in NIH trials for nevirapine to prevent mother-to-child HIV transmission, PMTCT, which underpinned a Lancet paper.
And Boehringer Ingelheim, the maker, relied on these trials for FDA approval.
Yes, but their own audit reportedly found serious non-compliance with FDA regulations and grisly mayhem.
Like lost records, including a logbook of adverse events and deaths.
That alleged loss is mentioned. Plus, documented cases of drugs given to the wrong babies, altered documents, poor follow-up, alarming health problems in the infants.
A safety report by a Dr. Smith raised concerns that could have blocked FDA approval.
That's discussed, yes. And then the book alleges Fauci used the useful idiot strategy like Gallo, using Margaret Heckler, by having President Bush announce PEPFAR to promote his AIDS agenda.
It details the case of Joyce Ann Hafford, who died of liver failure in a nevirapine trial despite known risks.
Yes, Celia Farber quoted calling it a methodical, calculated homicide. And the book alleges DAIDS officials tried to discredit Dr. Jonathan Fishbein for highlighting the study's flaws, framing it as him not understanding nevirapine's importance.
Okay, back to Robert Gallo briefly, his later actions.
The book mentions his 1991 admission of stealing the HIV virus from Montagnier. and a report that his HIV vaccine experiment killed 3 AIDS patients in Paris in 1990, getting expedited review from Cornys at NCI.
And his partnership with Robert Redfield at IHV.
Allegedly winning over $600 million in grants, including from NIH and Gates, to experiment with failed HIV drugs and vaccines on Black populations, mentioning their university affiliation and for-profit spinoff to monetize taxpayer-funded work.
Now, the role of foundations and global health groups, Rockefeller Foundation's historical influence.
Mentioned briefly for its global reach in public health. Then it notes Fauci's 2003 admission that HIV/AIDS wasn't behaving as predicted and anti-AIDS vaccine experiments had failed.
But Bill Gates was funding HIV vaccine development heavily.
Through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, yes. The book asserts Fauci and Gallo kept benefiting from the AIDS vaccine gravy train, despite no cure, calling Fauci's approach a religious crusade based on faith, not proof.
And Gates's increased focus on pandemics after Microsoft, funding COVID vaccines.
Yes, funding multiple efforts. The book highlights frequent promotion of remdesivir and new vaccines by both Gates and Fauci.
And Gates's funding of WHO and JVI, giving him leverage.
Significant contributions, yes. The book argues this gives him control over international health policy, serving his pharma partners' profit interests. It quotes a former WHO Director General complaining the budget was driven by donor interests,
raising concerns about the Gates Foundation's accountability and influence over WHO.
Undermining its independence, the book suggests. It also mentions Gates opposing Mandela's efforts to get generic AIDS drugs in South Africa, siding with pharma multinationals.
The book notes the eyebrow-raising deaths of anti-vaccine African leaders, mentioning conspiracy theories and referencing Reuters BMJ articles on the trend.
Right. And claims Gates's focus on vaccines diverted funds from basic nutrition and cheap devices, leading to preventable child deaths, allegedly deprioritizing drugs like hydroxychloroquine for malaria too, and funding media outlets, raising objectivity questions.
Okay, concerns about vaccine safety beyond COVID. Comarosal in Hep B vaccines and autism.
That alleged link in the CDC's 1999 Verstraeten study is mentioned.
And a Gates-funded Depo-Provera experiment in Ghana, deceiving women, violating ethics.
That's alleged, yes. Along with accusations from Kenyan Catholic doctors of a secret sterilization program disguised as tetanus shots, citing unusual WHO protocols.
It includes a quote from the Federal Register prioritizing vaccine use over addressing safety concerns.
From 1984, yes, prioritizing public health objectives. Also discusses the BMGF pushing oral polio vaccines with live virus in developing countries profitable for pharma, risky with poor sanitation, the book argues.
And experimental HPV vaccine tests on young girls in India.
Funded by the Gates Foundation, raising ethical flags given low cervical cancer risk there with pap smears. The book notes India's Ethics Council found violations, and a parliamentary committee criticized PATH for allegedly prioritizing manufacturers' commercial interests.
Let's go back to the 1976 swine flu pandemic. Fauci's role.
Described as a frontline spectator during what the book called the NIH's bogus pandemic, alleging NIH and CDC collaborated to spread fear and create vaccine demand.
Congressional investigators notes, Hilleman for Merck admitting it was politics, not science.
That's highlighted, yes, along with an alleged scheme by Merck and others with regulators to guarantee profits and shield pharma from liability.
Dr. John Anthony Morris protested, claimed the vaccine was dangerous and ineffective.
Yes, an NIH FDA scientist whose superiors allegedly tried to silence him.
His findings: flea vaccines causing fever, risks to pregnancy, and maybe childhood immunizations doing more harm than good overall.
Those concerns are mentioned. Plus, Wolf-Dieter Ludwig from Germany declaring health boards were taken in by a campaign of the pharmaceutical companies for profit. And the book notes no investigation of Fauci or others involved, while pharma profited and governments paid for injuries.
Concerns about antibody-dependent enhancement, ADE.
Right, the theoretical risk of vaccines worsening disease. The book includes a warning from a 2020 study in travel medicine and infectious disease about potential ADE with COVID vaccines, based on SARS-MERS animal studies.
And Dr. Paul Offit warning about it too, referencing the dengue vaccine where kids got sicker after vaccination.
Yes, that warning from Offit, a Merck spokesperson, is mentioned as well.
Okay, finally, the biosecurity agenda and germ games.
It sets a historical context. Bioweapons development, the U.S. signing the treaty but with a loophole for vaccine production. Rumsfeld arranging weapons shipments to Iraq in the 80s.
Then the shift from Soviets to terrorism justifying military spending and the rise of the biosecurity agenda.
Framing infectious disease as a national security threat needing a military response. Robert Kadlec's role in promoting this is highlighted.
NIH and IA funding Johns Hopkins, simulations run by Cadillac Gates.
Yes. The book alleges these simulations focused on military responses, media control, not public health, early treatment, or protecting the vulnerable. Concerns about Terra O'Toole's views on expanding biodefense and relaxing safety are also raised.
A New York Times exposé on Cadillac's secret vaccine contracts, granting flexibility, patent protection, liability immunity.
That's discussed. Plus, the Dark Winter simulations allege influence on the 2001 anthrax attacks narrative.
Rumsfeld and Schultz gaining financially from Gilead stock during the 2004 fake bird flu pandemic, supposedly orchestrated by Fauci and Farrar.
That allegation is included. And Fauci competing with the military for bioterrorism funding, announcing ambitious vaccine goals.
CIA involvement in bioweapons. Operation Paperclip, illegal bacteria bomblet.
Touched upon briefly. Emergent Biosolutions' dominant role in the strategic national stockpile is highlighted too. Connections leading to big contracts for its anthrax vaccine, despite alleged problems.
Emergent working with BARDA on COVID treatments, including remdesivir, and Gates' stake in Gilead.
Yes. And the book reiterates the claim that WHO studies showed remdesivir ineffective toxic, but Fauci allegedly rigged studies to suggest benefit, leading to FDA approval as standard of care.
NIH-CIA collaboration on torture obedience experiments.
Briefly mentioned. Then, a 2017 Gates Foundation pandemic plan allegedly focusing on limiting freedom, promoting vaccines, with media broadcasting propaganda and censoring.
Simulations like Atlantic Storm, Global Mercury preceding COVID.
Yes, focusing on pandemic scenarios. And Event 201 in October 2019.
The coronavirus simulation co-hosted by Gates Foundation, WEF, Johns Hopkins, seen by some as preparation.
Involving key figures from health, government, media industry. That's discussed, yes.
Avril Haines' strategy to flood the zone with propaganda from trusted sources.
To counter false information, yes. And finally, alleged involvement of Western intelligence agencies in the vaccine enterprise, Intel alumni in key health agency roles, and monitoring of COVID protesters, framing dissent as undermining state institutions.
Okay, so to bring it all together, this deep dive into excerpts from the real Anthony Fauci has really laid out a whole series of central arguments.
Yeah, quite a range.
We're talking serious allegations of deep-seated institutional corruption in public health agencies, the powerful influence of pharmaceutical companies leading to compromised regulation.
Regulatory capture, yeah.
A very critical portrayal of Dr. Fauci's actions and strategies, claims of suppressed alternative treatments and dissenting science, accusations of data manipulation.
To fit certain agendas, the book claims.
Right. Significant concerns raised about vaccine safety and this overarching influence of, well, wealthy individuals and organizations like Bill Gates in shaping global public health.
It's definitely a lot to take in. And it's really important, I think, to reiterate what we said at the start.
Absolutely.
This deep dive has just been an exploration of the claims and perspectives as they are presented within our source material, these excerpts from the real Anthony Fauci.
We haven't done any independent checking of these assertions.
Exactly. And our discussion here isn't an endorsement of any of these viewpoints. We're just reporting on what the excerpts say.
And that brings us to our final thought for you today. You know, considering the range of really serious concerns raised in these excerpts, what specific questions does this information prompt for you about the institutions, the individual involved in making this huge public health decisions?
Yeah, and how might you, using your own critical thinking, maybe exploring further, delve deeper into these really complex and undeniably important issues?
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.